The courtroom in District 4 was so silent you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Moments earlier, Richard Thorne, CEO of Thorne Logistics, had actually chuckled when Judge Harrison asked who was representing his wife. Richard looked at his $5,000 per hour legal team, smirked, and whispered, "She's representing herself. Watch this train wreck." He expected a stuttering, weeping mess. He expected a quick settlement. But when Sarah Thorne stood up, she didn't cry. She didn't stutter. She simply adjusted her glasses, opened a battered red leather notebook, and looked Richard dead in the eye. And when she finally spoke, the color drained from his face so fast it looked like he'd seen a ghost. What she said next didn't just end the marriage, it ended his entire life. The betrayal didn't happen in a dark alley or a motel room. It happened under the crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, amidst the clinking of champagne flutes and the polite laughter of New York's elite. It was October 14th, the night of the Thorne Logistics Charity Gala. Sarah Thorne stood by the heavy velvet curtains, watching her husband, Richard. He was in his element, a shark in a tuxedo. At 48, Richard was handsome, in that rugged, weathered way that money buys when you can afford the best dermatologists and personal trainers. He was holding court with 3 senators and the vice president of Chase Bank laughing at a joke he hadn't told. Sarah smoothed the front of her emerald silk gown. It was an old dress, one she'd bought 4 years ago. Richard had made a comment about it in the limousine on the way over. "That thing again, Sarah. We're worth $300 million. Try to look like it." She had just smiled the practiced, tight-lipped smile of a woman who had learned that silence was the only shield against his casual cruelty. For 20 years, Sarah had been the invisible engine behind Richard. When they met, he was a charismatic but disorganized trucking dispatcher with a mountain of debt. Sarah was the one with the mind for patterns. She was the one who stayed up until 4:00 a.m. mapping out logistics routes on their kitchen table, finding the inefficiencies, saving him pennies that turned into dollars and eventually millions. She had put her own dreams of being a forensic auditor on hold to raise their 2 children and build his empire. She was the foundation. But Richard had started to view her as part of the furniture. "Sarah!" The voice was shrill. It was Jessica Vane Richards' 26-year-old executive assistant. Jessica was wearing a dress that cost more than Sarah's first car. She approached with a sympathetic pout that didn't reach her cold, calculated eyes. "Richard wants you to mingle more," Jessica said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "He says you look like a wallflower over here. It's bad for the brand." "I'm fine, Jessica. My feet hurt," Sarah replied quietly. "Well," Jessica smirked, glancing at Sarah's sensible heels, "maybe if you wore stilettos like the rest of us, you'd build up a tolerance." Before Sarah could respond, the music stopped. Richard was on stage, tapping the microphone. The spotlight hit him, making his silver cufflinks sparkle. "Thank you all for coming," Richard boomed, his voice commanding the room. "Tonight is about the future. Thorne Logistics is expanding into Europe. We are unstoppable." The crowd cheered. Sarah clapped politely. Richard looked out into the audience, his eyes scanning past Sarah, as if she didn't exist, locking eyes with Jessica instead. "And?" Richard continued, a strange smirk playing on his lips. "Speaking of the future, sometimes we have to trim the dead weight to fly higher." The crowd laughed, thinking it was a business metaphor. Sarah felt a cold pit open in her stomach. As Richard stepped off the stage, a man in a cheap gray suit walked directly toward Sarah. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like a problem. "Sarah Thorne?" the man asked. "Yes." He shoved a thick manila envelope into her hands. "You've been served." The room seemed to tilt. The chatter of the party faded into a high-pitched ring in her ears. Sarah looked down at the bold text on the cover sheet, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. She looked up, searching for Richard. He was standing by the bar, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching her. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't coming to help. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a cruel smile on his face. Jessica was standing next to him, whispering something in his ear, and they both laughed. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a public execution. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't faint. She clutched the envelope to her chest, turned on her heel, and walked out of the gala. She didn't take the limo. She walked 6 blocks in the freezing October wind until she found a taxi. Inside the envelope, the terms were brutal. He was offering her the house in Connecticut, which she knew was leveraged with a second mortgage and $5,000 a month in alimony for 2 years. In exchange, she had to sign a strict NDA and relinquish all claims to Thorn Logistics. He was trying to erase her. He thought she was weak. He thought she was just the little woman who packed his lunch and raised his kids. He had forgotten who actually balanced the books in the early days. He had forgotten that Sarah didn't just know where the bodies were buried. She was the one who had dug the holes to save him years ago. The following Monday, Sarah sat in the plush leather chair of Arthur Sterling's office. Sterling was the most feared divorce attorney in the city. If you wanted to destroy your spouse, you hired Sterling. But Sarah wasn't there to hire him. She was there because Richard already had. She was there for the meet and confer, a mandatory attempt at settlement before the court date. The conference room smelled of expensive cologne and intimidation. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking bored. He checked his Rolex every 30 seconds. Beside him sat Arthur Sterling, a man who looked like a pit bull in a 3-piece suit. Sarah sat alone on the other side. Mrs. Thorne, Sterling began, sliding a document across the table. This is a generous offer. Richard is prepared to increase the alimony to $6,000 a month, but you must vacate the Manhattan penthouse by Friday. Jessica, excuse me, Mr. Thorne needs the space for business operations. Sarah looked at the document. Business operations? You mean his mistress is moving in? Richard chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Careful, Sarah. That sounds like slander. Jessica is a valued employee. I spoke to 3 lawyers this morning. Sarah said, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling beneath the table. None of them would take my case. Sterling smiled, revealing teeth that were too white. That's because I've already conflicted them out, Mrs. Thorne. We consulted with the top 10 firms in the city last week. Technically, they can't represent you now, and the ones left, they know better than to go up against me when the opposing party has limited liquidity. Limited liquidity? Sarah raised an eyebrow. We have joint accounts, which have been frozen pending the litigation, Richard said, leaning forward. You have access to a debit card with a $500 limit for groceries. That's it, Sarah. I'm cutting off the oxygen. Sign the papers. Take the Connecticut house. Go grow tomatoes or whatever it is you do all day. Sarah looked at her husband. She remembered the night 15 years ago when the IRS came knocking because of a payroll error Richard made. She had stayed up for 3 days straight, reconstructing the ledgers, finding the loophole, and drafting the letter that saved him from prison. She looked at his hands that were clean because she had kept them that way. I'm not signing, Sarah said. Sterling sighed dramatically, taking off his glasses. Sarah, be reasonable. You have no income, you have no degree, you have no lawyer. If we go to court, I will paint you as a clinically depressed, detached spouse who contributed 0 to the accumulation of assets. I will bury you in paperwork you can't understand and bills you can't pay. I want half, Sarah said. Half of Thorn Logistics. Half of the offshore holdings in the Caymans. half of the shell company Vanguard Shell that you use to funnel the government contract money. The room went dead silent. Richard's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Those are paranoid delusions. Are they? Sarah asked. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. Enough. If you want to play hardball, we will destroy you. You have 1 week to accept the deal, or we go to trial. And if we go to trial, I will ensure you walk away with nothing but your legal fees. Sarah stood up. She picked up her purse. Then we go to trial. Who are you going to get to represent you? Richard laughed, leaning back in his chair. Legal aid. A strip mall lawyer. Sarah paused at the door. She turned back, her expression unreadable. No one, Richard. I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth. You're going to represent yourself. Richard burst into laughter. It was a loud, genuine belly laugh. He looked at Sterling. Did you hear that Arthur, she's going pro se? She's going to represent herself against you. Sterling smirked. It's a suicide mission, Mrs. Thorne. The court system is a labyrinth. You won't even know how to file a motion, let alone argue one. We'll see, Sarah said. As she walked out of the office, she heard Richard's laughter following her down the hallway. Let her do it, Arthur. It'll be the best entertainment I've had in years. It'll be a slaughter. Sarah walked to the elevator. Once the doors closed, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook with a red leather cover. It was the notebook she had kept for 20 years. Every conversation, every account number, every shady transaction Richard had ever bragged about when he was drunk, it was all in there. She wasn't a lawyer, that was true. But she was a researcher, she was a mathematician, and she knew something Arthur Sterling didn't. Lawyers argue the law, but facts are bullets. And Sarah had a full magazine. She went straight to the public library. She didn't go to the romance section. She went to the law library on the 4th floor. She pulled down the books on civil procedure, forensic accounting and divorce, and the rules of evidence. She spent the next 3 weeks sleeping 4 hours a night. She turned her small guest room in the Connecticut house into a war room. She wasn't just preparing a defense. She was preparing a trap. The morning of the trial arrived. The sky was gray and heavy over the district court. Sarah arrived in a simple navy blue suit. She carried 2 heavy boxes of documents and her red notebook. As she entered the courtroom, she saw Richard. He was surrounded by a team of 4 associates, 2 paralegals, and Arthur Sterling. They had laptops, projectors, and leather binders. They looked like an army. Sarah walked to the defendant's table and set down her boxes. She sat alone. The bailiff's voice boomed. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. Judge Harrison was a stern man with a reputation for hating time wasters. He took his seat and looked over his glasses at the courtroom. He saw the army on the plaintiff's side. Then he looked at the lonely figure on the defense side. Mrs. Thorne, Judge Harrison said, his voice booming. I see you have not retained counsel. Are you expecting someone? Sarah stood up. No, Your Honor. I will be representing myself. From the plaintiff's table, a distinct, stifled laugh broke the silence. It was Richard. He covered his mouth, but his shaking shoulders gave him away. Arthur Sterling shook his head with a pitying smile. Judge Harrison frowned at Richard, then looked back at Sarah. Mrs. Thorne, I must advise you against this. Mr. Sterling is a veteran litigator. The rules of evidence are complex. The court cannot offer you assistance. You will be held to the same standard as a practiced attorney. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor, Sarah said clearly. Very well. The judge sighed, clearly expecting a long, tedious day of amateur mistakes. Mr. Sterling, your opening statement. Richard leaned over to Sterling and whispered loud enough for Sarah to hear. Make it quick, Arthur. I have a tea time at 3. Sarah opened her red notebook. She uncapped her pen. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at the empty witness chair. She wasn't just going to divorce Richard. She was going to dissect him. The courtroom air was stagnant, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. Arthur Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a practiced fluid motion. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. He paced in front of the judge's bench, projecting an air of weary sophistication as if he were apologizing to the court for even having to be there. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice smooth as silk. We are here today because of a refusal to accept reality. My client, Mr. Richard Thorne, is a titan of industry. He has built Thorne Logistics from a single truck into a multinational empire. He has worked 18-hour days, sacrificed his health, and carried the weight of thousands of employees on his back. Sterling paused, turning to look at Sarah with a look of pitiable disdain. And while Mr. Thorne was building the future, Sterling continued, Mrs. Thorne was drifting. We will present evidence that the marriage has been irretrievably broken for a decade. We will show that Mrs. Thorne has contributed nothing to the business since 2005. We will show that she has enjoyed a life of luxury provided entirely by my client's genius while offering no emotional or practical support in return. We are simply asking for a fair severance of ties based on the pre-marital assets and the clear delineation of effort. Sterling leaned on the podium. The defense, Mrs. Thorne is representing herself today because she believes she is entitled to half of an empire she didn't build. She is operating on emotion, Your Honor, but this court operates on facts, and the facts will show that Richard Thorne is the sole architect of this fortune. Sterling sat down. Richard smirked, leaning over to whisper, Good luck beating that. Judge Harrison turned to Sarah. Mrs. Thorne, you may make your opening statement. Keep it brief and stick to what you intend to prove. Sarah stood up. Her legs felt heavy, but her hands were steady. She walked to the center of the room. She didn't pace. She stood perfectly still. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice surprisingly low. The room had to lean in to hear her. Mr. Sterling is a very expensive storyteller. He tells a story of a brilliant man and a useless wife. It is a good story, but it is fiction. She walked back to her table and picked up the red notebook. She held it up. Mr. Sterling says I contributed nothing. He says I don't understand the business. I intend to prove that not only do I understand Thorne Logistics better than Mr. Thorne does, but I also know where every single missing dollar has gone for the last 15 years. I intend to prove that the assets Mr. Thorne has disclosed to this court represent less than 30% of his actual wealth. Richard's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Sterling frowned. And, Sarah continued, locking eyes with her husband, I intend to prove that Thorne Logistics is currently engaged in a systemic fraud against the Department of Transportation. A fraud that my husband orchestrated, believing that his useless wife was too busy gardening to notice he was using her social security number to sign the shell company documents. Objection. Sterling shot up, his face red. Prejudicial. These are wild, unsubstantiated accusations. It's an opening statement, Mr. Sterling. Judge Harrison said, his interest clearly piqued. He looked at Sarah with new eyes. Overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Thorne. I have nothing further for my opening, Your Honor, Sarah said. The evidence will do the talking. She sat down. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence of a predator noticing movement in the grass. "Call your first witness, Mr. Sterling," the judge said. "We call Richard Thorne," Sterling said, seemingly regaining his composure. Richard took the stand. He looked the part of the aggrieved billionaire. He answered Sterling's questions with charming humility. He talked about the stress of the market, the long nights, the burden of leadership. He painted a picture of Sarah as a ghost in her own home, a woman who spent her days shopping and her nights sleeping in a separate room. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling asked, "did your wife ever attend board meetings?" "No." Richard sighed. She found them boring. "Did she ever help with the accounts?" "Not since the early days, maybe 20 years ago, but she didn't understand the complexity of international shipping. I had to hire professionals." "And regarding your finances," Sterling said, handing him a document, "is this a true and accurate reflection of your current assets?" "It is," Richard said, solemnity. "It shows a net worth of $12 million largely tied up in illiquid stock options." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said. "Your witness." Judge Harrison looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Thorne, do you wish to cross-examine?" "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah stood up. She didn't take any papers with her. She just walked to the podium. "Mr. Thorne," she started using his formal title, "you stated you hired professionals because I didn't understand the complexity of the business. Who was the chief financial officer in 2018? Richard blinked. "Greg Myers." "And why was Mr. Myers fired in August of 2018? Richard shifted in his seat. He was incompetent. He made errors. Specific errors. Just general mismanagement." "Is it true," Sarah asked, her voice hardening, "that Mr. Myers was fired because he refused to categorize the purchase of a $4.5 million villa in Tuscany as a warehousing expense?" Sterling jumped up. "Objection, hearsay, lacks foundation. I have the email chain between Mr. Thorne and Mr. Myers right here," Sarah said, pulling a stapled packet from her box, "marked as Defense Exhibit A." The bailiff took the papers and handed them to the judge and Sterling. Sterling scanned the paper, his eyes widening. "Admitted," Judge Harrison said, looking at Richard. "Answer the question, Mr. Thorne." I don't recall that specific property," Richard stammered. "We look at hundreds of locations." "Let's move on," Sarah said, not letting him recover. "You claim your net worth is $12 million, and you listed your primary checking account as the one ending in 4490 at Chase Bank. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Do you have any other bank accounts, domestic or foreign?" "No. Everything else is a corporate account for the business." Sarah nodded slowly. She walked back to her table and picked up the red notebook. She opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. "Mr. Thorne, what is the Blue Heron?" Richard's face went pale. It was instantaneous. The charming billionaire mask slipped, revealing pure panic underneath. He licked his lips. I don't know what you're talking about. Is that a bird?" "It's a limited liability company registered in the Cayman Islands," Sarah said, reading from her notes. "Incorporated on November 2nd, 2019. The signatory on the account is not you. It's a man named Julian Vane." Sarah paused. "Julian Vane. That would be the brother of your assistant Jessica Vane, correct?" I have no idea what Jessica's brother does," Richard said, his voice rising in pitch. "Then can you explain," Sarah said, pulling out a bank transfer record blown up on a large poster board she had propped against her table, "why Thorne Logistics transferred $350,000 a month every month for the last 4 years to Blue Heron Consulting for logistical support." "Objection!" Sterling yelled. This is proprietary business information. It's irrelevant to the divorce. It's entirely relevant, Your Honor. Sarah shot back, her voice finally rising, echoing off the mahogany walls. He is claiming he has $12 million. I am showing that he has siphoned off over $16 million into an account controlled by his mistress's brother in an attempt to hide assets from this marital estate. Judge Harrison looked at the poster board. He looked at Richard, who was sweating profusely under the collar of his custom shirt. Overruled, the judge said, his voice icy. Mr. Thorne explained the payments. It was consulting, Richard squeaked. Valuable consulting. For what? Sarah pressed. Blue Heron has no website, no office, no employees. And the bank records show that as soon as the money hits the Cayman account, it is transferred to a personal account at the Bank of Valletta in Malta. An account in your name, Richard. Sarah pulled out another document. I have the SWIFT codes. I have the account numbers. I even have the login IP addresses. Guess where the account was accessed from last night? The IP address matches the Wi-Fi at the Pierre Hotel, where you are currently staying. The courtroom gasped. It was a cliché reaction, but it happened. The stenographer stopped typing for a second, mouth open. Richard looked at Sterling, begging for help. Sterling looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He had been ambushed. He realized then that his client had lied to him, and that the useless wife was a forensic genius. Richard stammered. No further questions for this witness at this time, Sarah said, closing her notebook with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. The lunch recess was a tense affair. Sarah sat in the cafeteria eating a sandwich she had brought from home. She saw Arthur Sterling arguing with Richard in the hallway through the glass doors. Richard was waving his arms. Sterling was rubbing his temples. They looked like a captain and first mate arguing over who steered the ship into the iceberg. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. Richard was no longer looking at Sarah with amusement. He was looking at her with hatred and fear. Mrs. Thorne, call your first witness, Judge Harrison said. I call Jessica Vane, Sarah said. The doors opened, and Jessica walked in. She looked less confident than she had at the gala. She was wearing a conservative gray suit, clearly chosen by Sterling to make her look like a professional rather than a mistress. But her eyes darted nervously around the room. Jessica took the oath. She sat down, avoiding Sarah's gaze. Ms. Vane. Sarah began, standing behind her table. How long have you worked for Thorne Logistics? 3 years, Jessica said, her voice tight. And what is your title? Executive Assistant to the CEO. And what are your duties? I manage Mr. Thorne's schedule. I book travel. I handle correspondence. Do you handle invoicing? Sometimes? Ms. Vane. Sarah walked around the table holding a document. I'm showing you Defense Exhibit C. This is an invoice from Vanguard Shell Corp. for $2.1 million regarding aircraft maintenance. Do you recognize this? Jessica squinted at the paper. I think so. We have a corporate jet. Yes, the Gulfstream G650. Sarah nodded. A beautiful plane. But here is the problem, Ms. Vane. I called the hangar manager at Teterboro Airport. He provided the maintenance logs for the Gulfstream. The plane hasn't had $1 million in maintenance in its entire lifespan. In fact, on the date of this invoice, the plane was sitting on the tarmac, unused. Sarah leaned in. So if Vanguard Shell didn't fix the plane, what did they do for $2.1 million? I don't know, Jessica whispered. I just process the bills Richard gives me. You just process them, Sarah repeated. Tell me, Ms. Vane, are you aware that Vanguard Shell Corp. is registered to a residential address in Scarsdale, New York? Jessica remained silent. An address, Sarah continued, that belongs to your mother. Sterling stood up, but he moved slowly as if he knew it was futile. Objection, relevance. Goes to credibility and fraud. Your Honor, Sarah said. Overruled, the judge said. Answer the question, Ms. Vane. It's just a mailing address, Jessica stammered. For an aircraft maintenance company, Sarah asked. Miss Vane, isn't it true that Vanguard Shell is a fake company set up to embezzle money from Thorn Logistics so that Richard could lower the company's reported profit, thereby lowering the amount he would have to pay me in a divorce? I didn't know. Jessica burst out, tears welling up. He told me it was for tax optimization. He said everyone does it. He said you wouldn't understand. I understand perfectly, Sarah said coldly. I understand that you signed as the treasurer of Vanguard Shell. Sarah projected a signature onto the screen in the courtroom. It was clearly Jessica's loop-filled handwriting. That is your signature, isn't it? Yes, Jessica sobbed. And are you aware that signing false corporate documents to facilitate tax evasion is a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison? Jessica turned to Richard, panic exploding in her eyes. You said it was legal, Richard. You said the lawyers approved it. Richard sat, stone-faced, staring at the table. He wouldn't look at her. No further questions, Sarah said. Jessica was led off the stand, shaking. The courtroom was buzzing. The bailiff had to bang his gavel twice to restore order. Your Honor, Sarah said, I have one final piece of evidence to submit before I rest my case. Proceed, Judge Harrison said. He was leaning forward entirely engrossed. This was no longer a divorce trial. It was an unraveling. Sarah reached into her box and pulled out an old yellowed piece of paper. It wasn't a bank statement. It wasn't a digital printout. It was a napkin. A cocktail napkin from a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor, dated 19 years ago. Mr. Sterling claimed in his opening statement that I was useless and contributed nothing to the creation of Thorn Logistics, Sarah said. He claimed Richard is the sole architect. She placed the napkin on the projector. On the napkin in blue ink was a diagram. It was a complex logistical map connecting 3 shipping hubs in the tri-state area. It was the original routing algorithm that allowed Thorn Logistics to undercut the competition by 15% in their first year. It was the secret sauce, the foundation of the empire. And at the bottom, signed in bold letters, designed by Sarah, executed by Richard. I drew this, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. 19 years ago, Richard was drunk. He was ready to give up. He wanted to sell his one truck and go work in a factory. I sat there for 4 hours and drew this map. I showed him how to chain the routes so the truck never drove empty. This napkin is the patent for his entire company. She looked at Richard. He finally looked up. His eyes were red. He remembered the napkin. He thought she had thrown it away years ago. I didn't just build the home, Richard, Sarah said, speaking directly to him, ignoring the judge, ignoring the lawyers. I built you. And you thought you could throw me away like a receipt. Mrs. Thorne, Judge Harrison interrupted gently. Is this submitted to prove intellectual property claims? No, Your Honor, Sarah said, composing herself. It is submitted to prove that my husband is a liar. If he lied about the origin of the company, and he lied about the Cayman accounts, and he lied to his mistress about the legality of his shell companies, then he is lying about the pre-nuptial agreement he is about to try and enforce. Sterling froze. He hadn't mentioned the prenup yet. He was saving it as his Hail Mary. Mr. Sterling, the judge asked, is there a pre-nuptial agreement? Yes, Your Honor, Sterling said, pulling a document from his briefcase. We were getting to that. It limits Mrs. Thorne's recovery to a fixed sum. I have a copy, Sarah said. Dated June 2001. But, Your Honor, I would like to call a surprise rebuttal witness regarding the validity of that document." "Who?" Sterling snapped. "You didn't list any other witnesses?" "I didn't list him because I didn't think I'd need him until Richard perjured himself regarding his sole ownership," Sarah said. "I call Mr. Elias Thorne." Richard's head snapped up. "My father. You can't call my father. He's in a nursing home. He has dementia. He has early-stage Alzheimer's," Sarah corrected. "But he has lucid days, and today is a very lucid day. I had my sister pick him up this morning." The back doors of the courtroom opened. An elderly man in a wheelchair was pushed in. He looked frail, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at Richard with deep disappointment. Richard stood up. "This is ridiculous. I object. This is elder abuse." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," Judge Harrison bellowed. "If the witness is competent, he will be heard." Sarah walked over to her father-in-law. She knelt beside the wheelchair. "Hello, Elias." "Hello, Sarah," the old man rasped. He reached out and patted her hand. "You look tired, dear." "I am Elias," she smiled sadly. "Elias, do you remember the day Richard and I got married?" "Rainy," Elias said. "It rained buckets." "Do you remember Richard asking me to sign a paper before the wedding? The prenup." Elias nodded. "Stupid thing. I told him not to do it." "Did I sign it, Elias?" Elias looked at Richard. "You signed it, Sarah. But Richard, he was so worried you'd leave him. He was insecure back then." "What did Richard do with the paper after I signed it, Elias?" The courtroom held its breath. Elias sighed. "He didn't file it with the lawyer. He put it in his safe, but he modified it first." "Modified it?" Judge Harrison asked. "He switched the pages," Elias said. "I watched him do it. He thought it was clever. He swapped the schedule of assets page. He wanted to hide the debt he had back then so you wouldn't know he was bankrupt. He forged the notary stamp on the new page." Sterling's face went gray. If the prenup had been tampered with by the beneficiary, it was void. Totally void. "Did he tell you why, Elias?" Sarah asked gently. "He said, 'Dad, if she knows I'm broke, she won't marry me. I have to fake it till I make it.'" Elias looked at his son. "I told you, Richie. I told you the truth always comes out. You can't build a house on sand." Richard slumped into his chair. He covered his face with his hands. The golden handcuffs were gone. The prenup was dead. The fraud was exposed. The mistress had turned. Sarah stood up and faced the judge. "The defense rests your honor." The silence following Sarah's declaration that the defense rests was heavy, suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a building demolition right before the charges detonate. Richard Thorne sat slumped in his chair, his face a mask of gray ash. His father Elias was wheeled out of the courtroom by the bailiff, shaking his head. He didn't look back at his son. That was the first dagger in Richard's heart. The second was Arthur Sterling packing his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Richard hissed, grabbing Sterling's sleeve. Sterling yanked his arm away, his eyes cold. "I'm preparing for the sanctions hearing, Richard. You lied to me. You suborned perjury. You forged documents. Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just lose a divorce case. You invited the federal government into your living room." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Harrison commanded. "I am not done with you." The judge adjusted his robe. He didn't ask for closing arguments. He didn't need them. The evidence wasn't just clear. It was overwhelming. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years. Judge Harrison began, his voice low and vibrating with controlled anger. "I have seen bitter divorces. I have seen infidelity. I have seen petty squabbles over china sets and dog custody, but rarely Mr. Thorne, have I seen such a comprehensive, malicious, and arrogant attempt to defraud a spouse and this court." Richard tried to stand up. "Your Honor, if I could just explain—" "You will remain seated." The judge's gavel cracked like a whip. "You have explained enough with your lies. You claimed poverty while funneling millions offshore. You claimed your wife was a burden while she was the intellectual author of your success. You gaslit this woman for decades." The judge put on his reading glasses and picked up a pen. He began to write, narrating his order as he went. Regarding the pre-nuptial agreement dated June 2001, based on the credible testimony of Elias Thorne and the clear evidence of tampering, I hereby declare the agreement null and void ab initio. It is a worthless piece of paper. Sarah let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 20 years. Regarding the division of assets, the judge continued. Normally, New York is an equitable distribution state. That usually means a fair split. However, given the egregious dissipation of marital assets through the fraudulent Blue Heron and Vanguard Shell entities, I am invoking my discretion to penalize the bad actor. The judge looked Richard in the eye. I am awarding Mrs. Sarah Thorne 100% of the marital home in Connecticut, 100% of the penthouse in Manhattan. And regarding Thorne Logistics, Richard held his breath. The company was his identity. It was his blood. Because the business was built on Mrs. Thorne's intellectual property, as evidenced by Defense Exhibit D, the napkin, and because leaving Mr. Thorne in control would likely result in further criminal looting of the company's assets, I am ordering the immediate transfer of 65% of the voting stock of Thorne Logistics to Sarah Thorne. You can't do that, Richard screamed, leaping to his feet. It's my company, I built it. She can't run a logistics empire. She's a housewife. Bailiff, the judge warned. Two uniformed officers stepped closer to Richard. The remaining 35%, the judge continued, ignoring the outburst, will be placed in a blind trust to be managed by a third-party administrator until the IRS and the Department of Justice have concluded their investigations. Mr. Thorne, you are hereby removed as CEO effective immediately. You are barred from entering the corporate offices. You are barred from accessing any company bank accounts. And finally, the judge said, setting down his pen, I am referring the transcripts of today's proceedings, specifically the testimony regarding Vanguard Shell Corp., and the tax filings to the district attorney's office for review regarding charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and forgery. Richard looked at Sterling. Do something, Sterling looked at the judge. Your Honor, my client requests a 24-hour stay to get his affairs in order. Denied, Judge Harrison said. Given the evidence of offshore accounts and a private jet, the court considers Mr. Thorne a significant flight risk. Bailiffs take Mr. Thorne into custody pending a bail hearing. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the room. Richard Thorne, the man who had laughed at the idea of his wife representing herself, was spun around by a bailiff. His expensive suit jacket was bunched up. His hands were behind his back. He looked at Sarah. He looked for fear, or regret, or love. He saw none of it. Sarah was packing her red notebook into her bag. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and looked at him. Sarah, Richard choked out, his voice breaking. Sarah, please, don't let them take me. I'll give you whatever you want. We can fix this. Sarah walked over to the railing. She looked at the man she had loved for half her life, the man who had slowly, methodically tried to erase her. You already gave me what I wanted, Richard, she said softly. What? What did I give you? He pleaded. You gave me a reason to stop being afraid. She turned her back on him. Officer, you can take him. As they dragged Richard out the side door, screaming for his lawyers, Sarah didn't watch. She walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The gallery filled with a few curious onlookers, and court regulars parted for her like she was royalty. Jessica Vane was sitting in the back row, her mascara running, looking terrified. As Sarah passed, Jessica shrank into her seat. Sarah stopped. She looked down at the young woman. She didn't scream at her. She didn't mock her. "Jessica," Sarah said calmly. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thorne." "Update your resume," Sarah said. "And get a good lawyer. You're going to need one more than you need a job." Sarah pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the hallway. The air in the courthouse was usually stale, but to her it tasted like oxygen. It tasted like freedom. 6 months later, the boardroom on the 40th floor of the Thorne Logistics Tower, now rebranded as Meridian Global, was buzzing. But it wasn't the frantic, fear-filled buzzing of the Richard era. It was the hum of productivity. Sarah sat at the head of the table. She wasn't wearing an old dress. She was wearing a tailored cream suit that screamed authority. Her hair was cut in a sharp, modern bob. "Okay, let's look at the European expansion routes," Sarah said, tapping the tablet in front of her. The new CFO, a woman named David Chen, whom Sarah had poached from Amazon, nodded. "The new algorithm you implemented for the fuel surcharges saved us 12% in Q1, Sarah. The shareholders are ecstatic. The stock is up 40% since the takeover." "Good," Sarah said. "Let's reinvest half of that into the driver pension fund. Richard gutted it for years. I want it fully funded by Christmas." "Yes, ma'am," Chen said. The meeting wrapped up, and the executives filed out. They respected her. Not because she was scary, but because she was right. She knew the business down to the bolts in the tires. She wasn't the housewife anymore. She was the architect. Her assistant knocked on the door. It wasn't a 20-year-old model. It was Mrs. Higgins, a 60-year-old woman with a steel trap mind who Sarah had hired personally. "Mrs. Thorne," Mrs. Higgins said, "your 200 p.m. is here." "I don't have a 200 p.m., Sarah said, frowning. "It's Mr. Sterling." Sarah paused. "Send him in." Arthur Sterling walked in. He looked different, humbled. He had lost the swagger. The Bar Association had suspended his license for 6 months for his lack of due diligence in the Thorne case, though he had avoided disbarment by claiming ignorance of Richard's crimes. "Sarah," Sterling said, nodding respectfully. "Or should I say, Madam CEO?" "What do you want, Arthur?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her papers. "I came to deliver this," Sterling said, placing a thick envelope on the table. "Richard asked me to bring it to you. He can't send mail easily from where he is." Richard was currently serving year 1 of a 12-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. The charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and embezzlement had stuck. The Blue Heron scheme had collapsed, and since Jessica had testified against him for immunity, Richard took the full fall. Sarah looked at the envelope. "I don't want it." "It's a letter," Sterling said, "and a deed." "A deed? He's relinquishing his remaining claim to the Connecticut house, the one the judge let him keep a small equity stake in. He says he wants you to sell it and use the money for Elias's care." Sarah softened slightly. Elias was in a premium memory care facility now paid for by Sarah. She visited him every Sunday. "Why is he doing this?" Sarah asked. "He's broken, Sarah," Sterling said quietly. "He spends his days working in the prison laundry. He told me that last week he tried to organize the laundry workflow to make it more efficient. He drew a diagram on a piece of paper." Sterling paused. He realized halfway through that he was drawing your diagram. The one from the napkin. He realized he never had a single original idea. He just had you. Sarah stared at the envelope. She felt a strange emotion. It wasn't forgiveness that would take a lifetime if it ever came at all. It was pity. "Tell him I'll take care of Elias," Sarah said. "I always have." "I will," Sterling said. He turned to leave, then stopped. "You know, in 30 years of practice, I've never seen anyone do what you did. I underestimated you. Everyone did." "That was your mistake," Sarah said. "You assumed that because I was quiet, I was blind. You forgot that the person who keeps the ledger is the only one who truly knows the score." Sterling nodded and left. Sarah walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over Manhattan. The city was moving below her, a million little lights, a million little logistics routes, crossing and intersecting. She thought about the red notebook. It was in a safe deposit box now. She didn't need it anymore. She had closed the account. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her son, now in college. "Mom saw the stock price. You're killing it dinner this weekend." Sarah smiled. She typed back, "Yes, I'll cook. And bring your laundry." She put the phone down. She wasn't just Sarah Thorne, the scorned wife. She wasn't just a victim. She was the CEO of her own life. She turned back to her desk, picked up her pen, and opened a fresh, clean notebook. This one wasn't red, it was blue, the color of open skies. She had a meeting with the Asian distributors in 10 minutes. She had an empire to run. And this time she was going to sign her own name on everything. 10 years later, the auditorium at Columbia Business School was packed. Every seat was filled with students standing in the aisles. The banner hanging above the stage read, "The Sarah Thorne Lecture on Ethical Leadership." Sarah stood at the podium. Her hair was silver now, a striking contrast to the sharp black blazer she wore. At 58, she radiated a quiet power that filled the room without the need for shouting. Meridian Global was now a Fortune 500 company leading the industry in sustainable logistics. "Many of you are here to learn how to win," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. "You want to know how to beat the competition, how to maximize profit, how to dominate." She paused, looking out at the sea of young, ambitious faces. "But I am here to tell you that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one shouting the loudest. It isn't the one with the most expensive suit. It is the one who observes, the one who listens, the one who keeps the receipts." A murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd. 10 years ago, I was told I was nothing. I was told I was a footnote in someone else's biography. My husband, a man who built his image on charisma, believed that because I was silent, I was stupid. He believed that because I was kind, I was weak. Sarah pressed a button on the clicker. The screen behind her changed. It wasn't a graph of stock prices. It was a picture of a framed napkin, the original napkin from the Rusty Anchor. It now hung in the lobby of her headquarters. "This is where it started," she said. "Not in a boardroom, but on a napkin. And it ended in a courtroom with a red notebook." She took a sip of water. "My ex-husband was released from federal prison last month," she continued. The room went deadly quiet. "He lives in a small apartment in Ohio now. He works at a hardware store. He sends me a letter once a year on our anniversary. He doesn't ask for money. He just apologizes. He writes that he spends his days thinking about the moments he laughed at me, realizing now that he was laughing at his own guardian angel." Sarah leaned forward, gripping the podium. "Do not mistake silence for submission. In business and in life, the truth is your only real asset. You can fake confidence. You can fake wealth, but you cannot fake the ledger. Eventually, the math always checks out. She closed her folder. Be the person who does the work, not the person who takes the credit. Because when the music stops, and it always stops, the one holding the truth is the only one left standing. The applause started slowly, then swelled into a thunderous standing ovation. Sarah watched them, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She didn't need the applause. She hadn't done it for the fame. She had done it to prove that she existed. As she walked off the stage, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the bank. The final payment for the Elias Thorne Memory Center had cleared. Her legacy wasn't just a company. It was a promise kept. Sarah walked out of the university and into the bright New York sunlight. She hailed a cab, not a limo. She didn't need the show. She had the substance. And that was enough. And that is the story of Sarah Thorne, the woman who turned a divorce court into a masterclass on vengeance and justice. It's a powerful reminder that the quietest people often have the loudest minds, and that you should never ever underestimate someone just because they don't brag about their value. Richard learned that lesson the hard way, losing his fortune, his freedom, and his reputation because he forgot who really built his empire. If this story gave you chills, or if you've ever felt underestimated and wanted to prove everyone wrong, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It helps us find more stories like this. And if you want to see more real-life dramas about karma justice and the truth coming out, subscribe and turn on notifications. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes? Would you have taken the settlement, or would you have fought back representing yourself? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, keep your receipts. The air in the courtroom was thick with greed and grief. On one side, the cheating husband Richard Vance and his perfectly manicured mistress Isabella sat poised to inherit a technology empire. On the other, 19-year-old twins, Liam and Chloe, their faces pale with loss. The final piece of evidence was a video deposition from their dying mother. On the large screen, Eleanor Vance, frail and weak, locked eyes with the camera. Then, in a moment that silenced the entire room, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed not at her husband, but directly at her heartbroken children. In that gesture, a multi-million-dollar estate hung in the balance. Isabella began to shake, not with excitement, but with pure, unadulterated fear. What trap had the dying mother set? The Vance family home in Atherton, California was a monument to modern success. Glass walls overlooked manicured gardens, and minimalist art adorned the sterile white walls. It was a house built by brilliance, but it had become a gilded cage of sorrow. The brilliance belonged to Eleanor Vance, the matriarch and the true architect of their fortune. Vance Innovations wasn't just named after her husband Richard. It was born from her mind. Her patents in biocompatible materials had revolutionized medical science and made them unimaginably wealthy. But now, Eleanor was dying. The diagnosis had come 6 months prior, stage 4, pancreatic cancer. It was a swift, brutal verdict that had shattered the pristine facade of their lives. For her twins, Liam and Chloe, it was as if the sun had decided to extinguish itself. Their mother, their source of warmth, logic, and unconditional love, was fading. They watched her grow frail, the vibrant light in her eyes dimming, but her mind, that razor-sharp intellect, remained untouched. Richard's grief, however, seemed performative. He was a master of the concerned sigh, the furrowed brow in public, the somber press statement about his wife's brave battle. In private, the cracks in the porcelain were becoming chasms. He was impatient, his conversations with doctors less about comfort and more about timelines. He spent less and less time at her bedside, citing urgent company business. The twins noticed. They noticed the scent of an unfamiliar, expensive perfume clinging to their father's suits. They saw the late-night texts that made him smile, a genuine smile they hadn't seen directed at their mother in years. The urgent company business had a name, Isabella Rossi. She was the new vice president of marketing at Vance Innovations, a woman a decade younger than Eleanor, with a serpentine grace and an ambition that burned cold and bright. She was everything. Eleanor wasn't overtly glamorous, politically cunning, rather than intellectually brilliant, and entirely focused on the wealth the company generated, not the good it did. One rainy Tuesday, Chloe had come home early from her university classes to find her father's car in the driveway. She entered the house quietly, hoping to read to her mother, only to hear laughter, a woman's throaty, confident laugh coming from the master bedroom. It was not her mother's room anymore. Eleanor now resided in a medically equipped suite downstairs closer to her nurses. Chloe's blood ran cold. She crept up the grand floating staircase and pushed the door open a crack. There was Isabella wrapped in her mother's favorite silk robe, sipping a glass of champagne. Richard was standing by the window, already dressed for an evening out. "Are you sure you have to meet with the lawyers again tomorrow?" Isabella purred, tracing the rim of her glass. "It's all so morbid." "It's necessary?" Richard set his back to the door. "Eleanor's old will splits everything. The company shares the estate. Half to me, half to the kids in a trust. That's not going to work. For us. So you'll have the new one ready for her to sign. Davies is finalizing it. Everything to me. The children will be provided for through a small allowance. She's so weak, so medicated. She won't even know what she's signing." Chloe felt a wave of nausea, so intense she had to clamp a hand over her mouth. She backed away silently, tears streaming down her face, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She stumbled down the stairs and out of the house, running into the cold rain until she found her brother Liam in the family library, poring over one of their mother's old engineering textbooks. She didn't have to say a word. The look on her face told him everything. The betrayal they had suspected was real. Their father was not just waiting for their mother to die. He was actively plotting to steal her legacy while she was still breathing with her replacement already comfortable in her home. That night, the twins made a solemn vow. They wouldn't let him win. They would protect their mother's life's work, even if they had no idea how. They went to their mother's room, their faces scrubbed clean of tears, but their eyes red-rimmed and fierce. Eleanor was awake, her gaze lucid. She looked from one distraught face to the other, and a flicker of sad, knowing intelligence passed through her eyes. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of its former strength. And so they did. They told her everything. They expected tears or rage. Instead, Eleanor Vance, the dying genius, simply closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, the dim light had been replaced by a familiar, steely fire. "Good," she said the word, holding a universe of meaning. "Now you know, and now we begin." Richard Vance considered himself a master strategist. He'd built a career on taking credit for Eleanor's genius, translating her complex scientific breakthroughs into digestible, profitable sound bites for investors. He was the face. She was the brain. He had long grown to resent this dynamic feeling like a well-dressed parrot. With Eleanor fading, he saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity, a final ultimate acquisition. His lawyer, a sleek corporate predator named Marcus Davies, had drafted the perfect document. It was a new last will and testament, a masterpiece of legalese that was both ironclad and brutal. It revoked all previous wills. It named Richard as the sole beneficiary of Eleanor Vance's entire estate, including her 51% controlling stake in Vance Innovations. The twins Liam and Chloe were relegated to a footnote, a trust fund containing a paltry $100,000 each, to be dispensed at Richard's discretion. It was an insult dressed up as a provision. The key is the setting Davies had advised stirring his espresso in a downtown high-rise office. No witnesses who are loyal to her, just you, me, and a notary who understands the delicate nature of the situation. We present it as a simple update, a formality to ease her mind. The day they chose was a Thursday. The twins had morning classes, and Eleanor's longtime personal nurse, a kind woman named Sarah, had the day off. Richard had arranged for a temporary agency nurse, someone with no personal connection to the family. He entered Eleanor's room with a practiced air of solemn concern. Isabella had coached him that morning. "Look sad, Richard. Look burdened, as if this is the hardest thing you've ever had to do." He played the part perfectly. He held Eleanor's frail hand. "My love." He began, his voice thick with false emotion. "We need to get our affairs in order, for the children, to make sure everything is simple and clean for them when the time comes." Eleanor, propped up on a sea of pillows, looked smaller than he had ever seen her. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes, usually so sharp, seemed clouded, distant. He felt a surge of confidence. She was too sick, too weak to fight. "A new will?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just an update," Richard soothed. "Davies is here to walk us through it. It simplifies everything. Puts it all in my name to manage. You know I'll always take care of Liam and Chloe." Davies stepped forward, all smooth reassurances and rustling papers. He summarized the document in vague, comforting terms, glossing over the brutal disinheritance of her children. He spoke of streamlining the estate and ensuring a smooth transition for the company. Eleanor was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. Richard and Davies exchanged a subtle, triumphant glance. She was succumbing. It was working. Finally, she gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Richard, if you think it's best." Davies produced a beautiful, weighty fountain pen, a Mont Blanc Richard noted with approval. A pen for signing away an empire. He uncapped it and handed it to Eleanor. Her hand trembled as she took it. She stared at the signature line, her name typed neatly beneath it. Eleanor Grace Vance. I can't." She breathed, her fingers struggling to grip the pen. So weak today. She looked at Richard, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Richard, my love, could you help me? Guide my hand." It was the perfect final touch to his charade, the loving husband helping his dying wife with her final act. It was poetic. He leaned over, placing his larger, stronger hand over hers. Together, their hands moved across the paper, forming a shaky but legible signature. The notary, a grim-faced woman who had been silent the entire time, stepped forward, stamped the page, and signed her own name. Davies witnessed it. It was done. As they packed their briefcases, Richard felt a wave of pure, unadulterated victory wash over him. He had it all. The company, the houses, the fortune, the future with Isabella. He leaned down to kiss Eleanor's forehead. Her skin was cool and dry. "Rest now, darling," he murmured. "It's all taken care of." She didn't respond. He assumed she had drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the effort. Later that evening, after Richard had left to celebrate with Isabella at a Michelin star restaurant, Liam and Chloe returned home. They found their mother awake, a strange clarity in her eyes. The temporary nurse was gone. Sitting in a chair by the bed was a woman they recognized instantly, Margaret Finch, their mother's oldest friend and her personal attorney for over 30 years. On the bedside table was a slim document folder and a different pen, a simple, elegant silver ballpoint. She did it, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She signed his will. Eleanor slowly shook her head. "No, my darlings," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "He thinks I signed his will. But Richard, for all his bluster, never pays attention to the details." Margaret Finch smiled, a thin, determined line. "Your father hired his own notary, but I hired the temp agency nurse for the day," she explained. "She is also a registered notary public, and she was our witness." Eleanor gestured to the folder on the table. "Richard had me sign his poison, but an hour later, with Margaret and a trusted witness, I signed my own." She then looked at the silver pen lying next to the folder. "And I used a very special pen." Liam picked it up. It looked perfectly normal. "What's special about it?" A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. "That my son is the detail Richard overlooked. He brought his ink, but I brought my own. And sometimes the message you can't see is the one that matters most." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor seemed to retreat into herself. Her moments of lucidity became shorter, her periods of sleep longer. Richard and Isabella, buoyed by the belief that their future was secure, became more brazen. Isabella started redecorating the house, her laughter echoing in hallways that were once filled with quiet, intellectual pursuit. She packed Eleanor's clothes into boxes for charity, replacing them with her own designer wardrobe. It was a slow, cruel erasure. The twins bore it all with a stoicism that belied their age. They spent every possible moment with their mother, not speaking of wills or betrayal, but of memories. They read her favorite poems, played her favorite classical music, and told her stories from their university classes. They were banking memories against the coming famine. During one of her clearer afternoons, Eleanor called them close. Her voice was a fragile wisp of sound. "My legacy is not this house, or the money in the bank," she whispered, her bony fingers gripping theirs. "It is Vance Innovations, but not the company it is now. The company it is meant to be." She directed Liam to a locked drawer in her antique writing desk. "The key is in the spine of my copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius." Liam found the book a worn, leather-bound volume and retrieved a small, ornate silver key. Inside the drawer was an intricately carved wooden box. It was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. "Everything you need is in there," Eleanor breathed. "But you cannot open it until after. And you must be together when you do. Promise me." They promised, their throats tight with emotion. "Your father sees the company as a machine for printing money," she continued, a spark of her old fire returning. "He's forgotten what it's for. Saving lives, pushing boundaries. Liam, your passion for engineering. Chloe, your gift for ethics and communication. You are the two halves of its soul. You must be its future." She taught them things in those final days, her words like precious gems carefully placed in their hands. She didn't give them business lessons in the traditional sense. She spoke to Liam about Project Nightingale, a top-secret R&D initiative she had been funding herself off the company's main books. It was a revolutionary biocompatible polymer designed for nerve regeneration. It was her magnum opus, the culmination of her life's work. "The data is encrypted," she told him, The algorithm is based on the Fibonacci sequence, but with a variable I derived from the prime numbers in our family's birth dates. Your father's mathematicians could look at it for 1,000 years and never break it. To Chloe, she spoke of leadership. Integrity is the only asset that can't be bought and can't be sold. When the time comes, people will follow the person who built the ship, not the one who's trying to drill holes in it to steal the cargo. Know your allies. Margaret Finch is a fortress. And trust your instincts. You have my heart, and it is a good heart. These conversations were her true will and testament whispered into the hearts of her children. They were forging the weapons they would need for the battle to come, a battle they still didn't fully comprehend. The twins clung to these lessons, and to the small wooden box as their mother slipped further away. Richard saw their quiet conferences as the harmless grieving of children. He was busy planning a future with Isabella, a trip to Monaco, the purchase of a yacht. He was measuring the drapes on a kingdom he already believed was his. He never once thought to look in the worn copy of Meditations, a book he had always considered pretentious. He never noticed the small wooden box, a trinket he would have dismissed as sentimental clutter. He saw only the frail woman in the bed, and the piece of paper she had signed, never imagining that her true power lay not in the ink he could see, but in the plans he could not. Eleanor Vance died on a Sunday morning, just as the sun was casting long golden fingers through the glass walls of her home. It was peaceful. Liam was holding one of her hands, Chloe the other. Her last breath was a quiet sigh, a release. The terrible, exhausting battle was finally over. For the twins, grief was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that stole the air from their lungs. But through the haze of their sorrow, they felt the weight of their promise of the small wooden box that now sat on Chloe's nightstand. Their mother's fight was over, but theirs was just beginning. The news of Eleanor's death seemed to invigorate Richard. The pretense of the grieving husband lasted less than 24 hours. The day after her passing, while Liam and Chloe were numbly attempting to make funeral arrangements, a large moving van pulled up to the house. Isabella Rossi stepped out dressed in a sharp, all-black pantsuit looking less like a mourner and more like a CEO conducting a hostile takeover. "We'll be renovating the West Wing," she announced to the bewildered twins, gesturing for the movers to begin unloading boxes filled with her possessions. "Richard and I feel a fresh start is in order. This house holds too many dreary memories." Chloe stared at her aghast. "My mother's body is not even cold. Have you no decency?" Isabella gave a dismissive little shrug. "Grief is a private process, Chloe. Life, however, goes on. And this is my life now. Our life. That was only the beginning." Richard, acting as the presumed sole heir, had the locks changed. He informed the twins that their access to family bank accounts was now under review to prevent any rash emotional spending. He canceled the caterer the twins had arranged for the funeral reception, a company their mother had loved, and replaced it with one favored by Isabella's social circle. He was systematically dismantling every trace of Eleanor, not just from the house, but from their lives. The twins felt like ghosts in their own home, strangers in a place that had always been their sanctuary. They ate their meals in the kitchen, while Richard and Isabella hosted quiet, celebratory dinners in the formal dining room, their laughter a poison seeping through the walls. The funeral was a hollow affair. Richard delivered a eulogy full of platitudes he'd likely had a speechwriter prepare, painting himself as the devastated partner who had supported his wife's brilliant career. The twins sat in the front row, their faces masks of stone, listening to the man who had betrayed their mother lionize himself over her coffin. After the service back at the house, Margaret Finch pulled the twins aside. Her expression was grim but resolute. "He's filed the will for probate," she said in a low voice. "He's moving fast, trying to consolidate his control over the company and the estate before anyone can challenge him. The hearing is set for next week." "Can he do that?" Liam asked, his voice raw. "He thinks he can," Margaret replied, her eyes glinting. "He believes he holds the winning hand. He's about to learn that your mother was playing an entirely different game." She looked at the twins, her gaze softening with a deep, abiding affection. "Your mother told me about the box. She told me to let you know that the time to open it is the night before you go to court." Not a moment sooner. That night alone in Chloe's room with the sounds of Richard and Isabella's expensive stereo system faintly audible downstairs, they finally took out the small carved wooden box. It felt warm, almost alive in their hands. With trembling fingers, Liam inserted the small silver key. The lock clicked open with a soft, satisfying sound. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, were two items. The first was a single folded sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. The second was a small, custom-made USB drive, shaped like a silver feather. Chloe carefully unfolded the letter. It was their mother's handwriting, weaker than they remembered, but still unmistakably hers. "My dearest Liam and Chloe, if you are reading this, then my part in our story is over, and yours is about to truly begin. I am so sorry for the deception I had to put you through, but it was the only way to protect you and to protect the work of my life. Your father will present a will in court. It is a document of his greed, not my love. Let him have his moment of imagined victory. Our victory will not be loud, but it will be absolute." The document I signed with Margaret is not a will. It is a corporate directive and a transfer of intellectual property. Wills can be contested, dragged through the courts for years. Corporate bylaws are a different matter. Project Nightingale. My nerve regeneration polymer was never an asset of Vance Innovations. I funded it personally through a private shell corporation. It is my personal intellectual property, and I have assigned 100% of that patent and the shell corporation that owns it to you. The USB drive contains all the data, the research, and the final algorithm. The password is the answer to the question I asked you every night when you were children. What are the two most powerful forces in the universe? Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she remembered. It was their nightly ritual. Her mother would tuck them in and ask the question. Their childish answers had ranged from dinosaurs to rockets, but their mother had always given them the same correct answer. Liam looked at his sister, a slow, dawning realization on his face. He whispered the password. "Love and mathematics." The letter continued. "Tomorrow in court, you will feel lost. You will feel like you are about to lose everything. Trust the plan. Trust Margaret. And most of all, trust each other. You are my true legacy. Now go and be brilliant. All my love forever. Mom." They held the letter, the tangible proof of their mother's foresight, her fierce love, her utter genius. It was not an inheritance of money she had left them. It was an inheritance of purpose. And for the first time since she had died, they felt not despair, but a powerful surging hope. Their mother had left them a weapon, and tomorrow they would finally learn how to use it. The probate court of Santa Clara County was a place of cold marble and colder realities. It was a room designed to strip emotion from loss, reducing life and love to assets and liabilities. Richard Vance, dressed in a somber but impeccably tailored charcoal suit, looked every bit the grieving widower and capable CEO. Beside him, Isabella Rossi sat like a sleek black panther, a picture of supportive elegance. Her dark sunglasses failed to hide the triumphant glint in her eyes. They looked at the twins who sat at the opposing table with Margaret Finch, with an air of dismissive pity. Judge Alistair Hayes, a man with a reputation for being thorough and impatient with theatrics, presided. He read from the document submitted by Richard's lawyer, Marcus Davies. "We are here to review the last will and testament of the deceased Eleanor Grace Vance, dated August 14th of this year." The judge began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Mr. Davies, please summarize your client's petition." Davies rose, radiating smug confidence. "Your Honor, it's quite straightforward. My client, Mr. Richard Vance, presents the final legally executed will of his late wife. In it, she leaves her entire estate, including all personal property, and her controlling shares in Vance Innovations to him. Mrs. Vance, in her final days, wished to simplify her affairs to ensure the continued stable leadership of the company and to provide for her husband. The will is clear, the signatures are witnessed and notarized. We petition the court to execute it as written." The judge nodded, peering over his glasses at the document. "I see the signatures. Richard Vance, Marcus Davies, and a notary, Ms. Helen Pike." He then looked over at Margaret Finch. "Ms. Finch, your clients are contesting this will." Margaret rose slowly, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Davies' slickness. "Your Honor, we are not here today to contest the validity of that specific document." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Richard and Isabella exchanged a look. "What game was this?" Davies smirked. "Then I'm not sure why we're here, Your Honor, if the will is not being contested." "We are here," Margaret interrupted, her voice clear and strong, "to present a subsequent superseding legal instrument, as well as evidence of undue influence and duress under which the will Mr. Davies has presented was signed." "Objection," Davies snapped. "There is no other will." "I didn't say it was a will," Margaret replied, coolly. "And as for evidence, we have a final deposition from Eleanor Vance herself." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. "A deposition? When was this taken?" "On the afternoon of August 14th. Margaret said, letting the date hang in the air. "Just a few hours after Mr. Vance and his lawyer had Mrs. Vance sign their document." Richard's face paled slightly. He remembered how exhausted Eleanor had been. How could she have given a deposition? It had to be a bluff. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, "my client was in a vulnerable state, heavily medicated and physically weak. She knew her husband was planning to disinherit her children. She felt she had no choice but to sign his document to appease him and get him out of her room. However, her mind was perfectly clear. We have medical testimony to that effect. She wished to make her true intentions known. With your permission, I would like to play the video of her final statement." The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded to the bailiff. "Proceed." A large screen was wheeled to the front of the courtroom. The lights were dimmed. Richard's heart began to beat a little faster. Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The video flickered to life. It showed Eleanor propped up in her bed, looking impossibly frail. But her eyes, when they found the camera lens, were burning with a fierce, lucid intelligence. Margaret Finch was visible, sitting beside her. "Please state your name for the record," Margaret's voice said from off-screen. "Eleanor Grace Vance," she replied, her own voice weak but steady. "Eleanor, are you of sound mind and body?" A small, sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. "My body has betrayed me, Margaret. My mind is my own. Did you earlier today sign a last will and testament presented to you by your husband, Richard Vance?" I did, Eleanor confirmed. Richard let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She admitted it. It was over. Isabella reached over and squeezed his hand, her own grin barely concealed. "And why did you sign it?" Margaret asked gently. "Because I was coerced," Eleanor said simply. "My husband and his associate Isabella Rossi have been waiting for me to die. They made it clear that my final days would be filled with conflict and distress unless I signed my legacy over to him. I am tired of fighting Margaret, so I signed the paper he put in front of me. I let him guide my hand and write my name." Richard shot to his feet. "Objection. This is slander." She was confused. "Medicated. Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Hayes barked, his eyes glued to the screen. On the video, Eleanor seemed to look right through the screen, her gaze finding Richard's. But a signature made under duress is not a reflection of my will. And Richard, for all his ambition, has always lacked attention to detail. Then Eleanor's gaze shifted, as if she were looking directly at her children. Her expression softened, filled with an overwhelming love that seemed to radiate from the screen. "To my true heirs," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "To the keepers of my legacy. To my heart and my soul. Liam and Chloe." Slowly, with what seemed like the last of her strength, she lifted her trembling right hand. She didn't wave. She didn't blow a kiss. She pointed. She pointed directly at the camera, her index finger steady, her eyes boring into the lens. The video froze on that image, the dying matriarch in her final act, anointing her chosen successors with a single, powerful gesture. The courtroom was utterly silent. And then Isabella Rossi started to shake. It began as a small tremor in her hands, then spread through her entire body. The triumphant grin was gone, replaced by a mask of dawning, horrified realization. This wasn't a simple, legal challenge. This was a ghost rising from the grave, and it was pointing right at them. The frozen image of Eleanor Vance, pointing with silent, damning authority, hung in the courtroom air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the quiet, rhythmic clicking of a pen from the court stenographer. Judge Hayes finally broke the spell. He cleared his throat, his gaze intense. "Ms. Finch, a powerful piece of theater, but a gesture is not a legal instrument. What is the substance of your claim, the substance, your honor?" Margaret said, turning from the screen to face him, "is twofold. First, the matter of the signature itself on the will presented by Mr. Vance." She walked to the clerk's desk, and with permission retrieved the will Richard had submitted. She placed it under a document camera, projecting it onto the screen next to the frozen image of Eleanor. "As you can see," Margaret continued, "the signature is shaky, which is to be expected. However, we had a forensic document analyst examine it. She produced a sworn affidavit. The analyst confirmed that while Eleanor Vance's hand held the pen, the pressure direction and controlling force of the signature are consistent with that of Richard Vance. It is in legal terms an assisted signature made under duress, a fact to which Mrs. Vance just testified." She then turned her attention to the silver pen that lay on her evidence table, the one from the wooden box. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we contend that Mrs. Vance signed another document that same day." She paused for effect. "Using this pen." Davies scoffed audibly. "A pen? What does a pen have to do with anything? This pen, Your Honor," Margaret said, holding it up, is filled with archival quality dual-spectrum ink. Visible to the naked eye is a standard blue ink. However, under ultraviolet light, it reveals a second layer of writing, a security feature often used in sensitive contracts. A bailiff at the judge's nod produced a handheld UV light. Margaret placed a blank piece of paper under the document camera, made a scribble with the pen, and the bailiff switched on the light. On the screen, glowing in a vibrant, ethereal green, were the blue marks, but embedded within them was a repeating microscopic pattern, the Vance Innovations logo. Isabella's shaking intensified. This level of planning was beyond anything she could have conceived. It was meticulous. It was brilliant. It was so Eleanor. And what document was signed with this pen, Ms. Finch? The judge asked, leaning forward. This was the moment. Margaret took a deep breath. It was not a new will, Your Honor. My client was too clever for that. She knew a competing will would lead to years of litigation draining the estate and hurting the company she spent her life building. Instead, she executed a document that makes the will Mr. Vance is so proud of almost entirely irrelevant. She produced a slim, bound folder. This is a legally binding transfer of assets signed, witnessed by a licensed notary, and executed on August 14th. In it, Eleanor Vance exercises her right as the owner of her own intellectual property she developed before and outside of her corporate duties at Vance Innovations. Specifically, the patent portfolio and all research data for a project known as Project Nightingale. Richard's face was a mask of confusion. Project Nightingale. That was a dead-end vanity project. It had no funding, no staff. It had no official funding. Margaret corrected him. Eleanor funded it herself for years through a private holding company she established in Delaware. It was her life's work entirely separate from the main corporation. In this document, she transfers 100% of the ownership of that holding company, and with it, the entire Project Nightingale patent into a newly formed irrevocable trust, the Nightingale Trust. Davies was on his feet. Your Honor, a single patent can't be worth that much. This is a distraction. On the contrary, Mr. Davies, Margaret said, her voice dropping as she delivered the killing blow. According to a third-party valuation we commissioned last week based on the final research data, Project Nightingale's revolutionary nerve regeneration polymer is projected to be one of the most significant medical breakthroughs of the century. Its estimated market value is $900 million. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Richard staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. $900 million. It was more than the current public valuation of Vance Innovations itself. And the beneficiaries of this irrevocable trust, Judge Hayes asked, his voice quiet. Margaret Finch looked directly at Liam and Chloe, who were staring at her, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and awe. The sole beneficiaries of the Nightingale Trust, she declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a gavel strike, are her children, Liam Vance and Chloe Vance. The trap had been sprung. Eleanor hadn't tried to take the kingdom back from Richard. She had, in her final days, quietly built an entirely new, far richer kingdom right under his nose and handed the keys directly to her children. The will Richard held gave him ownership of a company that was now without its founder's greatest creation, just a hollowed-out shell. He had won the battle for the castle, only to discover the real treasure had been smuggled out the back gate. Richard Vance stared at his children, no longer seeing grieving teenagers, but the faces of the billionaires who had outmaneuvered him. And beside him, Isabella Rossi finally stopped shaking. She simply sat frozen as the empire she had schemed and sacrificed her morality for turned to dust before her very eyes. Judge Alistair Hayes re-entered the courtroom with an air of finality. The room, which had been buzzing with hushed speculation, fell into a deep, expectant silence. He sat, adjusted his robes, and peered down over his spectacles, his gaze sweeping over the two tables before him. He did not look at Richard or Isabella. His focus was on the documents in front of him, as if the human drama were merely a footnote to the legal truth he was about to pronounce. After reviewing all presented documents and testimony, he began, his voice a low baritone that commanded the room's full attention. The court is prepared to issue its ruling. Richard Vance sat ramrod straight, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the polished table. A tiny, desperate part of him still believed. He had the will, a signed, notarized will. It had to mean something. Beside him, Isabella was a statue of Chanel, and tension, her breath held tight in her chest. The court finds the will, dated August 14th, presented by Mr. Richard Vance, to be technically valid in its execution, the judge stated. A sharp, audible intake of breath came from Isabella. Richard's heart leaped. Valid. The word was a lifeline. He shot a venomous, triumphant glance across the aisle at Margaret Finch. Her face remained impassive. Therefore, Judge Hayes continued, letting the word hang in the air. Mr. Vance is the legal heir to the estate of Eleanor Vance, as defined within that document. He paused, picked up the will, and held it as if it were a curious artifact. This includes all personal effects, real estate holdings, and her controlling 51% stake in the publicly traded corporation Vance Innovations. It was everything he wanted. He had won. Richard felt a dizzying wave of relief so potent it almost made him laugh. He reached for Isabella's hand, a gesture of shared victory. But her hand was ice cold and did not squeeze back. Her eyes, wide and fixed on the judge, held not triumph, but a dawning terror. She understood in a way Richard's ego-blinded mind could not, that the judge had not finished speaking. However, Judge Hayes said, and the word landed like a hammer blow, the definition and value of that estate is the central issue. The court finds that the preceding legal action taken by Mrs. Vance on the same day the formation of the Nightingale Trust and the transfer of her privately held intellectual property into said trust was a legitimate, binding, and irrevocable act. He set down the will and picked up the trust document Margaret had submitted. This court recognizes the Nightingale Trust as a valid and separate legal entity executed with clear mind and sound legal standing. The assets it contains are therefore not and were never part of the estate Mr. Vance has just inherited. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to roar. The judge looked directly at Richard now, and for the first time, a flicker of something almost like pity showed in his eyes. What this means in practical terms, Mr. Vance, is that you are now the owner of your late wife's personal belongings. You are the owner of the family home in Atherton, which public records show carries a mortgage of several $million. You are the owner of her stock portfolio, which court filings show she systematically liquidated over the past 2 years, presumably to fund the very project you now do not own. And yes, you are the majority shareholder of Vance Innovations. He let the silence stretch, forcing Richard to absorb the bitter reality of his winnings. A company the judge concluded, his voice dropping to a near whisper, whose stock was frozen by the SEC an hour ago, pending an investigation into why its leadership failed to disclose that its most promising R&D pipeline, its entire future, some might argue was private property that has now been signed over to a third party. The inheritance you schemed for Mr. Vance is an empty shell. You have inherited a title, a pile of debt, and a company in free fall. This court's business is concluded." The finality of the gavel's crack was lost on Richard. He was trapped in a soundless vortex of disbelief. The numbers, the words, they weren't making sense. Empty shell, pile of debt. It was impossible. He had the will. Isabella rose from her chair with a chilling, unnatural calm. She picked up her handbag, her movements precise and detached. She did not look at Richard. It was as if he had already ceased to exist. "Isabella." He croaked his voice a stranger's in his own ears. She turned her head slowly, her sunglasses masking her eyes, but not the utter contempt that twisted her lips. "You were a fool, Richard," she said, her voice low and serrated. "You were so busy playing the king you didn't realize she was the one who owned the entire chessboard." I backed a losing horse. "Goodbye." She walked away without a second glance, her heels clicking a death knell on the marble floor for the future they had planned. She didn't just walk out of the courtroom. She walked out of his life, leaving him alone with the ruins. "Davies." His lawyer approached, his own face ashen. "Richard, we can appeal, we can. Get away from me." Richard snarled, finally finding his voice, which was thick with a rage born of utter humiliation. He stumbled out of the courtroom, pushing past a throng of reporters who had gotten wind of the verdict and were now shouting questions. He didn't answer. He fled a fallen emperor, deserting his own disastrous battlefield. Across the room, Liam and Chloe remained seated, the wave of the verdict washing over them, not with triumph, but with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. It was over. Their mother's name had been honored. Her legacy was safe. Margaret Finch placed a comforting hand on each of their shoulders. She did it. Chloe whispered the tears that had been held back for weeks, finally spilling over hot and cleansing. She protected us. She always did. Margaret said, her own voice thick with emotion. She just made sure the final time would count the most. "Come on, let's get you out of here." They left through a private exit, avoiding the media circus devouring their father. The car ride to Margaret's apartment was silent, the three of them wrapped in a shared cocoon of grief and relief. Margaret's home was a sanctuary of old books, warm wood, and the scent of brewing tea. It was the antithesis of the cold, glass-walled house they no longer considered home. For an hour they just sat sipping tea, allowing the turmoil of the day to settle. Then wordlessly, Liam retrieved the small wooden box from his backpack. He placed it on the coffee table between them. The silver feather USB drive seemed to hum with a latent energy. With a shared, steadying glance, they connected it to Margaret's laptop. The password prompt appeared a final gateway. Chloe typed the words that had been their mother's answer to everything, the core of her philosophy, the lullaby of their childhood. Love and mathematics. The drive unlocked. It was a universe of their mother's mind folders of dense research, elegant algorithms, videos of simulated nerve regeneration. And one file set apart from the rest, labeled simply "For My Nightingales." Liam clicked play. Their mother filled the screen. She was in her lab, looking younger, healthier, the ravages of her illness not yet fully upon her. A whiteboard behind her was a beautiful chaos of molecular diagrams and equations. She smiled, and the warmth of it felt real, as if she were in the room with them. "Hello, my darlings," she began. The sound of her voice, so full of life, was a beautiful, painful gift. "If you're watching this, it means it all worked. It means you were strong and you were brave and you trusted the plan. I never doubted you for a second." She spoke for 20 minutes. She explained the science not like a lecturer, but like a mother telling a magnificent story, linking the Fibonacci sequence in her algorithm to the patterns on a seashell they'd found together on a beach years ago. She pointed out how the polymer chain was structured like the harmonies in a Bach fugue that Liam loved. It was a message coded in their shared history, a map only they could truly read. "Your father," she said, her expression softening, with a deep sadness, always saw the company as a prize to be won. He never understood that it was a tool, a means to an end. The purpose was never the money, my loves. It was this. She gestured to the equations behind her. Healing people. That's the Vance legacy, not the stock price, not the house. The healing. Her eyes seemed to look right through the screen into their very souls. This will be hard. People will tell you you're too young. They will try to take this from you. Don't let them. Liam, your mind is brilliant and logical. Trust it. Chloe, your heart is fierce and compassionate. Lead with it. Together you are unstoppable. You are my perfect equation. She reached a hand towards the camera, as if to cup their faces. I have to go now, but know this. Every life you change with this work, every person who walks again because of what's on this drive, I'll be there. I will always be with you. I love you both, more than all the stars in the universe. Now go, and be brilliant. The screen went black. For a long time, the only sound in the room was their quiet sobbing. It was a grief mixed with an overwhelming sense of purpose. Their mother hadn't just left them a fortune. She had left them a mission, a map, and her unconditional belief in them. The next morning, while the financial world reeled from the collapse of Vance Innovations, the Nightingale Trust issued its first public statement. Written by Chloe, with technical specifications vetted by Liam, it announced not just the existence of the trust, but its mission to ethically and affordably bring nerve regeneration technology to the world. They didn't move into a penthouse. They didn't celebrate. Their first act as the heads of a billion-dollar enterprise was to drive to their mother's old off-campus research lab. It had been preserved exactly as she had left it. The whiteboard with her beautiful chaotic equations was still there. Standing in that quiet, sacred space surrounded by the evidence of their mother's genius, they finally understood. The courtroom battle wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Their inheritance wasn't the money. It was the work. And as the morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Liam picked up an eraser, looked at his sister, and for the first time in a long time, they both smiled. There was a whole new board to fill. The work of the Nightingales had just begun. Eleanor Vance's final act wasn't one of revenge, but of profound love and meticulous justice. She proved that the sharpest mind and the most loving heart are the most powerful assets of all. She ensured her legacy wouldn't be squandered by greed, but would flourish in the hands of those she cherished most, becoming a force for healing in the world. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the battles you win in life, but the legacy of love and integrity you leave behind. Liam and Chloe didn't just inherit a company, they inherited their mother's unbreakable spirit. What did you think of Eleanor's brilliant and intricate plan? Was it the perfect justice for her cheating husband? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of a mother's fierce love and incredible foresight touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to light.